So my name is Pete. I'm here today on behalf of Equal Experts. We're a software consultancy based in London. Always looking for talented individuals to come and join our team. It's a great place to work. If you would like to know more, feel free to come and ask me after the presentation. So today we're going to talk about everyone's favourite place to work. And I don't mean Equal Experts, I mean the enterprise. I'm a long-term enterprise sufferer. I've worked on innumerate enterprise-y projects, and I guess I've suffered for my sins somewhere along the line. So there's a quick rundown of what we're going to look at today. I'm going to do a quick intro. I'm basically going to tell you a few stories from my own kind of personal experience, and I'm going to try and at the end see if I can offer some practical solutions. They're going to be stories about experiences I've encountered and how I would approach those situations differently now, knowing what I do about working in the enterprise, and perhaps how, if any of you guys are in a similar situation, you may be able to apply as well. I should add before I start, though, if you're looking for a magic bullet of some kind of cure-all solution for the enterprise, then I don't have one of those. If I did, I would probably be doing contracts exclusively in Hawaii or hot tropical locations and earning lots of money. And the other thing to note is that it's intended to be quite light-hearted. I guess there's an important message underneath this talk, but it's very objective. Most of it is all from my own particular viewpoint, which may not be the same as anyone else's. So I guess take some of it with a pinch of salt, if you will, and hopefully we'll have some fun along the way. So I'm going to start with a story. So the year is 2006, and I am a fledgling developer in my first permanent employment, and I'm very excited. And the reason I'm very excited, ladies and gentlemen, is that I've just discovered an amazing new technology that's going to revolutionize the way me and my team work. It's called Ajax. And it's very shiny and new and exciting. And I've built, in my own time, with my own bare hands, an auto-completing drop-down. This is a state-of-the-art web component. And I've kind of sneakily installed this on a non-customer-facing part of our system, and I'm going to unleash it upon the world, and great things will happen. So I schedule a meeting with the dev lead and the technical architect. I sit them down and I show them, I go, look at this, isn't this amazing? When our customer's going to love this, when can we start using it? And the architect and the tech lead kind of looked at each other, and then they looked back at me and said, I'm sorry, Pete, we're going to have to take that out. I had not seen this coming. This was a complete shock to me. I thought this was brilliant. I had no idea what reason they possibly could have to fault this amazing component. So I pressed them on the issue, and they said, well, a customer might see it, and they might want it. And again, I was thinking to myself, surely that's the point. You developers innovate and kind of build useful things, and then that filters down to the customers, and everyone benefits. But no, they were absolutely adamant that in this case, the decision was final and we would not be adopting this particular technology. And again, I just could not understand this. And I guess this was my rude awakening to the world of enterprise development. And anyone who's worked in an enterprise knows that it elicits a wide range of emotions. So we've seen confusion, and here's fear and madness. But most of all, frustration. Frustration, I think, seems to be the overriding emotion we feel working in the enterprise. I'm sure everyone's had a moment like I did where you think, oh, I could do better than these. They should put me in charge. Then we'll see how great software can be made. They should put me in charge. So what can you do about it? If you find yourself in this situation, what are your options? Well, first I'm going to add a quick definition of enterprise development, because every time I do this talk, someone comes up to me afterwards and says something along the lines of, oh, I disagree with your definition of enterprise. That's not what I think of enterprise at all. And so I've added this just as a quick run-through. So I see an enterprise organization as one that typically may have an in-house development team working on a product that's They don't sell the product, but it's intrinsic to their business model. Maybe it's their internal teams work using that software. Or it may be that they've built this software and now they're offering it as an off-the-shelf solution. But the point is they don't make bespoke software directly for clients. They have a product that they're trying to sell, use internally, or sell as an off-the-shelf product. And it can include organizations of any size. In fact, large organizations tend to have their own special problems because they have this mindset where they can throw contractors at problems and money at things, and maybe problems will go away, and of course they don't. But most of my experience is going to come from the kind of the SME, the small and medium-size enterprises. So how many people, if we have a quick show of hands, how many people would consider themselves to be an enterprise employee? It's a reasonable number. And how many of you have heard a phrase along the similar lines of the title, as in, it doesn't work that way in enterprise, or you can't apply that knowledge to the real world? More. Yes, maybe this is not just an enterprise problem. So finally, how many of you have given this advice to maybe a junior or other people in your team? A few brave people putting their hands up. I'm sure there's more here. What has happened to my clicker? There we go. So why is life in the enterprise so bad? I mean, no one ever sets out to build bad software, right? It's not like you have this, I've got a great idea about how to make money. I'm going to do it by cutting corners and basically writing shoddy software. You tend to have this situation where there's a kind of microcosm of bureaucracy. There's a very small team. Everyone has strong opinions. Things are kind of done because they're the way they've always been done. And small problems tend to get magnified within the enterprise because people talk to people over coffee breaks and things are going backwards and forwards and magnifying. The enterprise mindset can often come from a poorly managed transition from a startup. You know, if you're rushing to get your MVP out the door, you're not necessarily going to be focused really highly on code quality, and if you don't manage that transition properly, all of a sudden you've got a huge pile of legacy code and you're in a lot of trouble. Within the enterprise world, in the types of companies that I've described, there's a lack of competition. Because if you're building a piece of software that's for use internally, then there's no one else building another piece of software that might be better. There's no incentive for you to really improve upon that other than just the day-to-day profitability of your business. But if you've reached a certain point, then you don't have that extra incentive that you would do in a true capitalist marketplace. And finally, this one might seem a bit weird, but I believe that enterprise companies suffer from an excess of funds. So we all know that it's cheaper to write good quality software, to be agile and to respond to needs as they come. But if your company is meeting or exceeding all of their budget targets with a slightly inefficient process, then they have no reason to change that, because why would they need to? Their shareholders are happy, the board is happy, and that you can get by without bringing new people in that have new knowledge from outside, then they're just going to carry on with the status quo. So what are your options? It's pretty simple, really. You can leave and find somewhere better to work, or you can stay and try and take control of the situation. And it's this latter point that I'm going to try and focus on today, because we can all leave and find a new job. Well, actually, you need to identify the fact that you might be better off in another job first. But staying and taking control of the situation is the hard part. That's the bit that you are able to make a difference, but it's not always really easy to see how. So as I say, I will try and provide a bit of a balance. I'm going to focus on the latter point. I'll try and tell you what I did, my experiences, and what I would do differently in the future. And suffice to say, if you think you've got it bad at work, then you haven't heard anything yet. So I'm going to start with a fairly basic complaint in the enterprise world. That's where practices and processes, or maybe lack of processes, are mandated on developers from stakeholders of the business that really have no business telling developers what to do. So I did computer science at uni, and suffice to say, I was quite a naive young developer. I remember kind of going through my modules and the studies and kind of thinking how haphazard everything seemed. Like the code exercises were all very much focused on the end result, and there was I think I remember maybe 1 or 2 lectures in the whole 3-year course where they mentioned refactoring or code quality or tests. So there was no emphasis on any of this. And I remember thinking to myself, God, when I get a real job, when I get a job, I'm going to have to do things completely differently. If someone's business is relying on the software that I produce, then it's going to have to be top quality. It's going to have to be the best code that I've ever written. Nothing like this. Did I mention I was naive? But anyway, imagine my shock when I turn up at my first permanent employment and things aren't perfect. In fact, they are far from perfect. There is nothing but piles and piles of this procedural style classic ASP code for this web application. And no best practices to speak of, no unit tests, absolutely none of this stuff at all. And this was not the world I expected to find myself in. Now, it wasn't all bad. You know, they had a robust security model in place. We were protecting against all the usual injection attacks, cross-site scripting, that kind of stuff. So I guess the fundamentals of the business part of things were reasonably sound. But there was a catch. The software that we had to use as developers day to day was incredibly slow. There was this admin UI, and basically it was what I call an emergent domain. So it's a thing that a lot of businesses are chasing, where they want non-technical people to be able to do a lot of the work configuring the system. So you build all these big admin pages where you can have a form generator, and you can. This one was quite cool. You could even change the database schema from within the app. It was quite interesting. But yeah, this thing was so slow. So if you wanted to build a form, like a data entry form, run-of-the-mill thing, you would click once, and it had a frame set. Remember those? You click once in the top frame. You wait for the bottom frame to load, and you type your details. Press save. Wait for both frames to reload, and then you can edit the next one. And these forms were comprised of hundreds. And the worst thing was that this was the required approach. This was how you actually did your job. This process was mandated by the company. If you tried to go off track and do things in your own way, you could obviously, if a customer had a requirement that wasn't covered by the form generator, you can obviously just go and edit the code. But you would get in a lot of trouble for doing that. And of course, I hated this. You know, this frustrated me like nothing else. At this point, I kind of realized I'm a very lazy developer. And I don't mean that I took long lunches and, left early. I'm referring to this definition you can see behind me. Because usually what happens in a software organization is developers get sick of manual repetitive tasks, so they take a little bit of time out. Maybe they do some of this on their own time, and they build something that then makes that task easier in the future. And the more you do that, the more time you get to build other little things that save you time in the future. And you kind of get this innovation snowball where the development process is getting quicker, you're continually improving, and you can pass those benefits on to your clients. And what was happening in this case was completely the opposite. They were actually stifling that kind of creativity and that innovation that actually is vital for driving your business forward. Essentially, the only people who could have done anything about this situation, the developers, their hands had been effectively tied behind their back, like typing with one foot, whatever. So unfortunately, the reality is that frustrations such as this are actually quite normal in the enterprise world. There's always going to be some kind of subpar tooling that unless you're very lucky, you're probably going to have to put up with something like this. And as I mentioned earlier, as long as a process is profitable overall, it'll be allowed to continue. It doesn't matter how much it hurts your code OCD that this terrible, inefficient process is in place. And I say, there's always going to be some kind of process, but it should never come at the expense of innovation, because that's what keeps your business alive, and that's what allows you to iterate and stay in the marketplace and be ahead of your competitors. But thankfully, you can take control of the situation. There are things you can do that can help. Don't stop being a lazy developer. Even if everyone else around you is just doing what they're told, keep at it. You should know deep down that what you're doing is right, and you should believe in yourself, and try not to let it affect. If people are expecting you to deliver, then of course make sure you deliver, but you also make sure you're still innovating at the same time, even if it means kind of taking a bit of your own time to do it. So if you try hard enough, there are always going to be ways in which you can speed yourself up. As I said, consider you're committing your own time, and keep innovating and don't give up. I like to think that it's your duty to innovate, regardless how difficult your company are making it. You can chip away at these things. I guess it's all about doing the best you can, but also recognizing a situation in which you have reached a point where there is no more you can do. So, but in order to reach that point, you have to have first at least tried. So, let's look now at an area where a lot of enterprise frustration arises, in the long-term maintainability of your software, and that phrase that everyone loves, technical debt. So I don't know any company that doesn't have a huge mountain of technical debt to deal with at some point, various different ways of managing it. So this next story starts, I'd been with a company about a year. I think this was probably about 2007. And the company I was working for was embarking on an ambitious upgrade from classic ASP to ASP.NET. And it's going to be the single biggest change that this company had ever experienced. Truly monumental stuff. And I saw this as my time to shine. I thought, I have prior .NET experience. I'd done some of that in my dissertation. This is my chance to show them what I'm made of and to really make my mark on this company. So I happened to know that .NET 2 was actually just around the corner, so I kind of had a chat with them. I managed to convince them to hold off on this upgrade until the new version was out, so they could skip a second upgrade process. And they seemed to quite like that advice. They were very happy with it, and that was that. And so time passed, as it does in the enterprise, but soon enough, a meeting was called. We were told that the upgrade was imminent, and we were all given various bits of various articles to read to familiarize ourselves with the process. And I actually managed to find one of these articles, and I've included a choice quote from it here, and I'll read it out. So most developers will probably choose to rewrite existing ASP applications to gain the performance, readability, and maintainability improvements of the new development environment. And of course, this seemed like a great approach. I mean, it involves a fairly significant rewrite of some of the code, but the benefits, I thought, were obvious. So we had no hard deadlines for this upgrade. It was, we were trying vaguely to fit it in the summer period where we had a few less client demands than we otherwise would do, but it's a completely internal thing. We had literally no pressure in order to do this. So we had all the time in the world, so why not do it right? But of course, we're forgetting something. And that is that it doesn't work that way in enterprise. So this was the approach the company decided to take. Now, I don't know if everyone can see this at the back, but this is a download page for a command line tool that takes classic ASP as an input and exports ASP.NET code. What can possibly go wrong with such a tool? So essentially what we're doing is we're converting our code verbatim, line by line, with no structural changes whatsoever. We're moving from a procedural to an object-oriented environment with no structural code changes. Surely nothing can go wrong. So a spreadsheet was made. Because, of course, this thing produced horrible, horrible code with thousands upon thousands of errors. So a spreadsheet was made, of course. Spreadsheets are the answer to everything. And all of the, where are spreadsheets? Shout out for the spreadsheet. And so all of the compilation errors were tallied up, because, of course, now we have an IDE to work in, and we can do all these things. We can compile things ahead of time. Isn't this brilliant? And export it to a spreadsheet. And then that was divided up amongst the 5 to 6 developers in the team. And the next 12 weeks, which is pretty much 16 weeks by the time we were finished, of my life and the life of all the other developers in the team, was spent fixing compilation errors one by one from a spreadsheet. Now, I think we often make jokes as developers about how our jobs are costing us our sanity and it's a hard life, etc. But I actually genuinely started to question my career choice at this point. It was so monotonous. And then when the compilation errors were fixed, we had to do the runtime errors as well. So remember, there are no automated tests of any kind, no golden master, none of this, newfangled stuff. We literally had, with a team of 5 or 6 developers, we had to hit every single line of code in this system. 300,000, 400,000 lines. Now somehow, maybe it was because we had so many developers with such rich domain knowledge, we did eventually manage to come through this and get out the other side. But it was certainly not an experience I would ever want to repeat. So what conclusions can we draw from this? I mean, obviously this is a very extreme case of a company making a very poor choice that's going to affect their future. But to be fair, I've probably worked for one company in my whole career that has genuinely worked proactively. Or maybe 2 now, actually, because I wrote this talk a little while ago. But most enterprise companies are going to be guilty of not planning to the future to some extent. If we know, firefighting after the event is much, much more common. Sometimes there is no management of technical debt at all, but as I'll talk about in a minute, this is actually rarer than you might think. But this is a really interesting point. There aren't really any studies or metrics that we can easily put in front of a non-technical person and say, here is a concrete example of actions X, Y, and Z operating in an agile way, doing test first. And there are very few teams that have ever run such a kind of side-by-side comparison. It's very difficult science to actually perform. So it can be very difficult to communicate this. And I think Microsoft tried in their research division at some point, but it's interesting, you never really stopped it. If only we had something like this, it would be so easy, and you could just say, you will save 20% by adopting these approaches. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. So, again, you can take control of the situation. Start the conversation. This is probably the most important bullet point I have in this entire presentation today. I kind of have an analogy where software engineering is a little bit like politics, working within a software engineering team. There are lots of people that have a say, but not all of them can actually directly influence the decisions being made. So it's important that everyone talks about the politics. It's important that everyone talks to each other and understands what the issues facing your team are, or the issues facing your government, so that if enough people feel the same way, they can come together and their voice will be louder than just the individual and something can be done about it. It's such an important thing that everyone talks about the problems you're having and expresses themselves in that way. Lead by example. This is another maybe quite obvious point. But if you're lucky enough to be in a lead role and to be someone who is attending conferences, who knows the state of the industry, who knows what's right and how to create good software, stick to your guns. I can't stress this enough. If you lead by example, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We all know that the software will be better, it will be quicker to respond to changes. So if you stick to your line long enough, it will become evident and someone will notice. I mentioned about management of technical debt. So if you think there is no approach to technical debt in your company, ask the architect, ask the dev lead or whoever what their strategy is. Because it could be that their strategy is to work for 2 years and then throw all of the code away and start again. That is a strategy. It may not necessarily be the one that we'd all like to be working with, but that's better than no strategy. Not every company intends to iterate on the same code base for a long period of time. So as long as there is some understanding of the impact of technical debt, then actually maybe the situation you're in feels very frustrating, but maybe actually it's not so bad. And maybe even if you did leave your job and move on somewhere else, you might find exactly the same frustrations elsewhere. So, this story is the one I feel most strongly about. How many of you have worked for a company that thought their idea was best, was better than everyone else, and their approach was the approach, and anything you can read in books is probably just a waste of time. A few people reluctant maybe to put their hands up. If he had more hands, I think he would put them up. So it's interesting because we all kind of associate these big problems, like the company is not agile enough. These are big changes. To go from a waterfall-style company to an agile company, that touches the entire company. It's a very big change. But actually, companies can struggle a lot more with just the basics. So we're back to the company I was talking about earlier. And the main bread and butter aspect of their business was taking this code base that they had already created and basically building an implementation for a particular client. So they would tailor this thing to the client requirements. They would build data entry forms. They would tweak the database schema for their specific needs. So what would happen is a project manager would go in and they would fill out a data dictionary, which is another spreadsheet, and it would detail all of the fields that they required and all of the specific tweaks, and you would basically work from this. Because I'm a it was a sneak preview. Because I'm a lazy developer, of course, I had this process down to a T. I had actually some macros and then some search and replace that would take the spreadsheet and turn it into SQL insert statements and basically do it 4 to 5 days faster than some of the other members of the team. And I wanted to make this the next big focus. Now that the upgrade was done, I wanted this to become, the next thing. What if we could save a week on all our projects? That would be pretty revolutionary, right? But of course, these guys had another idea. They had a more pressing issue that they wanted to address. And that was that all of our client implementations pretty much shared 90% of the same code. So if you had multiple, implementations sitting on different servers, different apps, sharing 90% of the code, how would you solve that problem in a statically typed, precompilable way? It's not actually a trick question at all. It's just you would build a library, right? And you would put something in a DLL or a jar, and you would share the code. But these guys had a better idea. And what they decided to do was take this 90% of the code, and they marked this as what they called base. So this is now the base code. There's no actual physical, technical difference, except that code is now, you're not allowed to change it. So it's still there in your implementation, but it's base. That's the base code. Easy, right? Because now all you can do is change the client-specific bits. Problem solved. But yeah, so they thought this was a good approach. So they created a team. The base team was created, and these guys are going to work on the base code, iterate on that, and then everyone else is going to stick doing the client implementations. And this was quite a the company was kind of founded on a very fair philosophy. They wanted to include, equal opportunities for everyone, which was partly what attracted me to the company in the first place. So they decided they were going to rotate people around the team. So you would spend 3 to 6 months in the base team, and then you would go back off and do your implementations for a little while, and everyone would get a turn. This sounds great, right? In reality, it was absolutely awful. It was the worst possible strategy. Well, firstly, it created a kind of us and them mentality. Everyone knew that the base stuff was going to be more fun. And so you were kind of waiting for your turn, and then some people the client deadline has shifted, and sorry, you've missed this for 6 months now, and Johnny, new developer, is going to take it instead. And just as people were getting up to speed, they hadn't actually done much coding in the implementation projects because 90% of the code, you're not allowed to change it. And there were a few bits that actually involved coding, but most of the work involved dealing with these hideous admin screens. So just as a developer got up to speed and started to become productive in the base team, they would get rotated off. And so no one would ever really accumulate enough knowledge to truly contribute as well as they should do. But the other unexpected issue of this might actually sound, okay, so now we've got a base team, we're iterating, they're versioning things, and that might help somewhere along the line rather than just having big piles of code. But actually, you would have to decide what version a customer was going to be on before you'd even started the project. And if you wanted to upgrade the version, the base version for that client, that is a new project, which takes roughly 2 to 3 months of both a developer and a project manager. So this obviously made hot fixes almost impossible. What do you think their solution was to when they absolutely needed to apply a security fix to a customer? They had a spreadsheet. They used to add a record in a spreadsheet. It was the changes to live implementation spreadsheet. And you would have to track everything in there. Now, I mentioned how a company can kind of fail on more basic things. Now, source control, right? You'd think this is a basic skill. Most junior developers should be, if not already familiar with source control, they should be able to get up to speed on it pretty quickly. Our solution was to actually do away with source control altogether. Brilliant. It wasn't so much as a conscious thing as more of a slide into disuse, but no one, once it was gone, no one particularly was in any hurry to bring it back. So instead what you would do is, so if you're starting a new client implementation, you would take the base code and you would copy it from a directory on the network drive, and then you would just copy it and you would start working. And it gets better. When I say you copied it, you didn't actually copy it to your local machine. Because getting your local machine set up in such a way that you can actually run the software was considered far too time-consuming for an average developer. They should be focusing on delivering things for a client. So you would copy this to a remote server, and then you would hook into this using remote debugging in Visual Studio. And if you had more than one developer working on a particular application, these developers would all hook in a similar way. And this wasn't just for implementations. This actually went to the base team as well. So you have 5 or 6 developers, maybe more at this point, building new features in the same code base, in the same physical location. And I don't mean it's the same code base. I mean this is the same directory on the same server. So if someone introduces a compilation error, everyone stops working. You get a yellow screen of death. And it was, I worked in that office for, I didn't actually work on the base team myself. I worked in the office and it would be like, oh, ha, who's broken it now again? And everyone would lose like 10 or 15 minutes and context switch. And I was just like, no, this is not funny. This is terrible. How are you possibly allowing this to continue? And I guess that's kind of, that was indicative of a lot of things in this particular company. They had their way of working, and they were working around other problems and solving them with, quite frankly, broken solutions. And no source control to speak of. Now, as a side note, I had a friend of mine, the first time I gave this talk, a friend of mine came up to me and was like, I've got a story for you. You should totally include this. And he's like, my last company, a source control solution was a thumb drive. So if you wanted to commit your changes, you would put your hand up and say, who's got the thumb drive? And then you would take it and you put it in. But it's a great way to solve any kind of concurrency problems. You never get a complicated merge with such a solution. And I just thought it was quite amusing. In fact, I would have killed for a thumb drive at this point. You know, that would have been luxury for me. Anyway, the moral of this story is that you probably shouldn't worry if your team can't quite get semantic versioning right, or maybe your continuous integration pipeline doesn't quite reach production. Because, quite frankly, there are far many more things that could be going wrong. As I say, companies often seem to reject technologies, new technologies. They can kind of think, oh, that's a bit whizzy, that's a bit shiny, maybe it's not the best thing to use. And it sometimes may seem like this is happening for no good reason, but actually I think that's rarely the case. Sometimes it's a fear of change, or I think we do ourselves a disservice sometimes. There's, certainly in the Microsoft camp, everything is kind of released with such fanfare. It's like the new version of MVC. It's going to revolutionize everything you do, and whoever it is, Steve Ballmer or Scott Hanselman is there telling you how great this is going to be. And I think it puts some companies off, because they're like, well, they get the feeling that it's experimental, that it's trendy, or maybe that it hasn't had time to bed in properly. And I'm sure we're all guilty of this. what we tend to try, as human beings, we tend to try and find a clever solution for something, even if a simple one might be staring us in the face. And we may often kind of sidestep an established solution, an industry standard piece of knowledge, because maybe we've got a slightly cleverer solution that is going to make us feel a little bit more clever. But most of all, your team should always be able to react quickly to client demands. If you are having trouble releasing a hotfix, a security hotfix to your system because of how you've decided to version your code, then that should be a big red flag, and that is quite possibly an indicator that you may need to give up and go and find yourself a new company. So for the final time, you can take control of the situation. Share your knowledge. It's kind of similar to having the conversation, but don't necessarily try to convince people that their approach is wrong. You know, it's more important to actually show people actual live working code, demonstrate how something is going to be useful. It can be easy to kind of go, look how cool this is with my Ajax drop-down. You know, perhaps that was the problem I made. I was like, look how cool this was, as opposed to saying, look how useful this piece of code might be. It's really important when you're trying to convince your company to adopt a new technology or to do something in a slightly different way that you know why they should do it, and not just what it is and how they should do it. If you have this information, it can be much easier to convince the people who actually make the decisions. And it's really important as well to introduce people to the wider community. Like developers like us, individuals in organizations such as ourselves, we go to conferences, we may have pet projects, we may contribute to open source. Other developers may not even know that this stuff exists. They may have been a senior developer at the same company for like 5, 6, 7 years, and they may not actually realize that there's a whole world of people willing to help, a whole kind of like internet community dedicated to actually making code fun and actually helping people to rekindle their interest in their career and realize that actually it can be more than just typing the codes all day and doing your upgrades or what have you. But there's actually a whole ecosystem out there. But these people may actually not even realize, and if you just show them that, then that could revolutionize how you work with them and how they work themselves. Now, final thing I'll say on this is that it's really important as well to fight the cause, the underlying cause, rather than the symptoms. So firefighting and working late nights to hit deadlines, these are all symptoms of an underlying problem. And if you can identify what the problem is and tackle it from that approach, then it's a much better solution. You will find that you meet with much more success when you start taking that approach. So, I've talked a lot about the technical pitfalls of making software. But actually there are just as many kind of personal elements that can trip a company up as well. And I'm just going to touch on this in the last 5 minutes or so. So you may actually be in a company where the tech story is great. You're working with the very latest stuff every time that there's a new update. That filters down to you, and the technical stuff is absolutely brilliant. But if there's a culture of bullying, if there's misogyny and just poisonous interpersonal relationships, then you're not going to stay in that company for very long. That is a very obvious sign that you need to move on. However, if the tech stuff isn't so good, but you get on famously with all the people you work with your best mates, you go to the pub on a Friday and everything's, you work with people you really care about and you really value, then that makes the decision to leave all that much more difficult. This is a double-edged sword because it may be that the best thing for your career at this point is to move on, but it can make that very, very difficult. So don't forget about the people element of building software. I think we end up with this situation where developers are often treated as a liability. rather than a resource. Now, I've certainly been in situations where the amount of, like take the base code example, it's limiting the scope that an individual has to make a mistake. I think the theory in enterprise is sometimes along the lines of if you don't allow people, you don't give them the tools with which to make mistakes, then they won't. But obviously this goes against a fundamental piece of human nature, and that is that we learn by making mistakes. So if your developers are not afforded the amount of responsibility necessary for them to try things and to fail, and then to try again and succeed, if they don't have this freedom, then your whole business model is going to be stifled, and it kind of links back to the problems about innovation that we talked about earlier. Has anyone seen this, where staff get promoted just because they've been there the longest? Where it may not actually be directly related to their skill set, but they're the next person in line. And we had a position at a company I worked for that was technical architect. And that person wrote specs. That was their job. And they reported to the development manager, who was the actual technical architect. And essentially, we'd got to a point where we needed to give people new titles in order to make them feel like they've been promoted. You can give them a pay rise, but they actually felt like they needed to give people titles that didn't necessarily really mean anything. And this is not a good way of working. You end up with this, what I call a rungs on the ladder kind of promotion strategy. That's where the only way to actually rise up the ranks in the company is for enough new people to come in underneath you that then you can be a team leader now for more people, or now they need to split the team, they need to be 3 team leaders, and then only as people leave at the top can everyone rise up, because it's all based on, first into the company, first out. It's all one ladder. And finally, I don't think anyone actually does this deliberately, but you'll find that people in positions of responsibility will kind of subconsciously try and protect their own interests. If there's a developer 2 years their junior that actually may be much better suited to their role than the individual in question, then they're not just going to step aside and say, oh, you should be doing this job, you're better than me, I'll go back and be a junior developer. People will always kind of subconsciously protect their interests, even if they're not doing it on purpose. I'm sure there will be some people out there who are vindictive enough to do that on purpose, but it does happen, and it's kind of just something to bear in mind. But most of all, as a developer, you should be prepared to say no. Now, there's a talk by Uncle Bob, by Bob Martin, where he talks about the 12 habits of your new CTO, and he basically touches on the fact that if your boss comes to you and say, I need this done by Friday, if you don't think that this can be done by Friday, then you have to say no. It's your duty to stand up for yourself and say, actually, no, this is unrealistic, and it can't be done. I can do it by Tuesday, or maybe best case by Monday, but I cannot do something that is impossible. That's a really important note to remember. So, we're almost at the end. So this is the bit you've all been waiting for. What is the solution? What can we do about the enterprise problem? You guys are the solution. So, if your code is bad, whose fault is that? It's the developer's fault, because they wrote it. Maybe the management were putting pressure on them, but if you don't say no, and you end up writing bad code anyway, then if it wasn't for developers, we would have no bad code at all. We're all responsible for the code we write. So you may not always be able to control what other people do. You may not always be able to affect every decision that's made in your enterprise company, but you can always control what you do in terms of leading by example and starting the conversation. It's really important you remain true to yourself and believe in the standards that you've come to learn, and that you have that level of integrity to actually stand up for what you believe in. But most importantly, it can often help to take a step back. I never had much success in my enterprise company. As I say, I think I would do things very differently if I was back in that situation now. But when I became a contractor, I I started saying, okay, well, here are the pros and cons of my approach, here are the pros and cons of your approach. Now, I've given you the information that you now have to make a decision. And all of a sudden, it became about the decision that they were making. They were free to decide what they wanted. I'd just given them the information. And I actually found that this approach was vastly more effective than my kind of previous, oh, we should really use this. Have you seen this? Have you seen this? It was something that's kind of been invaluable to me in my later career. But you should always make sure that you recognize a situation in which it's the right time to walk away. So here is my golden rule I'll leave you with. In order to answer the question, should I stay at my company, my enterprise company, and try and make it better, or should I leave? It's, are you still learning anything that will be relevant to you in your future career? If you cannot answer yes to this question, then it's probably time to find a new job. And of course, there's that old saying, change your job or change your job. And that's pretty much all I have to say. I hope you've enjoyed listening. And that's it. We're pretty much out of time. So thank you very much, and enjoy the final closing keynote.